The blizzard was howling. The engines were louder. The wind screamed down Highway 70 like a banshee loosed from the Rockies, slamming into the windows of the North Star bar hard enough to rattle the bolts in the frame. Snow flew sideways, thick and angry, swirling under the flickering neon sign that buzzed open in a desperate red. And then cutting through the storm like steel thunder came the sound that made Martin Greaves freeze in place. Motorcycles. Not just one. Not two. 20. Their engines roared like war drums behind the wall of snow, low and guttural, vibrating the frozen ground beneath his boots. Martin slowly set down the battered coffee pot in his hand, narrowed his eyes, and walked toward the frost-laced front window, wiping it with a sleeve. He saw headlights first, then shadows hulking machines, Harleys mostly. Black leather patches, helmets pulled low. The storm churned around them like they didn't even care, and at the head of the line, dismounting with a slow, deliberate swing of the leg, was a figure Martin didn't expect. A woman. She was tall, jet black hair slicked with snow-tight braid down her back, heavy leather jacket creaking as she moved. Tattoos snaked down her neck and arms barely visible beneath frost. Her expression was unreadable. Cold, yes, but not cruel. A scar curled beneath her left ear like punctuation on a sentence she never finished, and on her shoulder, a gleaming emblem of a skeletal wolf surrounded by flames. Martin had seen patches like that before. He'd served long enough to know the look of someone who led, not by vote, but by fear, earned and followed. And yet, despite the wildness of the scene, his instincts didn't scream danger. Not exactly. They screamed something else. Responsibility. Ellie, his 5-year-old daughter, peeked her head out from behind the kitchen doorframe, teddy bear clutched to her chest. "Daddy?" she asked softly. Martin looked back at her, then turned to the door. He didn't hesitate. With a single breath, he grabbed the olive-drab army jacket hanging from the rack near the door, the same jacket he wore through 2 tours and a dozen dust storms, and swung it off his shoulders. As the woman reached the diner steps, her face pale from cold, he opened the door into the screaming wind and draped the jacket over her shoulders without a word. Her eyes met his, blue-gray like ice under moonlight. For half a second, something flickered in them. Surprise, confusion, maybe even gratitude. Then she nodded once, and 20 fierce bikers, leather-clad, frostbitten, exhausted, followed their leader inside the light. If this moment just gripped your heart like it gripped hers, keep reading. This isn't just a story about a storm. It's about the people we become when no one else is looking, and what happens when kindness dares to challenge fear. Stay with us. The roar is just beginning. Martin shut the door behind the last rider and bolted at wind, still howling outside like a ghost denied entry. The sudden warmth inside made the newcomers blink. Fog formed on their jackets. Snow dripped from their boots onto the cracked linoleum. They stood still, unsure, like wolves not used to being invited indoors. Ellie remained half-hidden behind the counter. Her eyes were wide, but curious, not afraid. One biker, a younger man with a trembling lip and hands red from cold, caught sight of her. She tilted her head, then gently offered him her wool scarf. He froze, blinked, then slowly accepted it like it was sacred. The woman, clearly their leader, held Martin's gaze. "We'll pay for whatever food you have," she said. Voice low and steady, rough like gravel warmed over fire. "We don't want trouble, just shelter." Martin studied her, the way the others stood slightly behind her, the way no one spoke unless she had. Authority wasn't just assumed, it was carved into her bones. "You've got it," he said. "Coffee's hot. Fire's on. Sit where you like." A murmur of disbelief passed through the group. Relief, too. No one had expected the Army vet running a roadside diner with a little girl to open his doors to 20 frostbitten bikers in the middle of the worst blizzard in years. But Martin had seen war. He'd seen what fear looked like, and this wasn't it. This was need. They needed heat, food, rest. They needed someone to believe they were more than what the world called them. Martin didn't flinch when the man with a split eyebrow and death's fangs tattooed across his neck sat down. He didn't look away when the giant with no sleeves and brass knuckles laid carefully folded gloves beside a napkin holder. And when the woman removed the army jacket from her shoulders to return it to him, Martin simply said, "Keep it." She paused. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," Martin replied. "It's warmth. Call it even." She looked at him again, and this time something cracked. Just a little. A thin smile, so faint it almost didn't exist, tugged at the corner of her mouth. Then she walked to the booth farthest from the windows and sat. Martin returned to the kitchen, put on a fresh pot of coffee, and reached for the last 2 cans of tomato soup in the pantry. He'd figure it out tomorrow. For tonight, he'd keep the light on. The storm hadn't slowed. If anything, it had grown angrier. Snow slapped against the glass of the North Star bar like fists demanding entry. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, its red light struggling against the white void. Inside, the contrast was almost surreal. Heat hummed from the old furnace. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the room. 20 leather-clad strangers sat hunched over steaming mugs, their shoulders thawing their boots, dripping puddles on the linoleum. And at the center of it all, Martin Greaves moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had lived too many nights under pressure. He carried himself like the storm. Outside was just another battlefield, and maybe for him it was. Ellie trailed behind him, her little shoes squeaking on the floor. She clutched her teddy bear in one hand and tugged at his sleeve with the other. "Daddy," she whispered. "Are they bad guys?" Martin crouched, so his eyes were level with hers. The room hushed a little, as if 20 sets of ears were waiting for his answer. "They're people who've been out in the cold too long," he said softly. "And sometimes all someone needs is a little warmth to remember who they are." Ellie considered this, then nodded as though her father had explained the mysteries of the universe. From across the room, the woman with the tattoos and the snow-damp braid, clearly their leader, watched the exchange. Something unreadable flickered across her face. The bikers began to loosen. One shrugged off his heavy jacket, revealing a flannel shirt stretched tight across broad shoulders. Another pulled off his gloves, hands scarred but careful, as he cupped the hot coffee mug like it was the only fire left in the world. Martin set bowls of soup down one by one. It wasn't much, 2 cans stretched with water and a little salt, but none of the riders complained. They ate with the quiet respect of men and women who knew the value of a hot meal when there might not be another. The youngest of the group, a wiry man with trembling fingers and a patch that read Prospect, struggled to hold his spoon steady. Ellie padded over, dragging a napkin from the counter, and placed it beside him without a word. The boy looked at her, as though she'd handed him a treasure. His lips twitched into a nervous smile. The leader finally spoke. Her voice carried weight, the kind that settled a room. "My name's Raven Knox," she said. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. "We've been riding since dawn. Roads shut down 10 miles back. If you hadn't opened your door—" She let the sentence hang. Everyone in the room knew how it would have ended. Martin studied her. Strong posture, chin high, but her hands trembled slightly around the coffee mug. Not fear, fatigue. A body pushed past its limits. "Name's Martin," he said simply. "That's Ellie." He tilted his head toward his daughter, who waved shyly before burying her face in her bear. This place is called the North Star. Always been meant to stay lit no matter the weather. The words hung in the air. For a heartbeat, even the storm outside seemed to pause. It was Duke, the thick-armed sergeant-at-arms, who broke the silence. His gravelly voice carried both authority and exhaustion. "We can pay," he said, reaching for his wallet with hands that looked like they could bend steel. "Food, lodging, whatever's left in your cupboards, we'll cover it." Martin shook his head. "Not tonight. Tonight, you're guests. Tomorrow," he sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's left." The bikers exchanged glances. Gratitude, suspicion, maybe both. For people used to doors slammed in their faces, trust didn't come easy. But Martin hadn't flinched when 20 roaring engines had stopped at his door. He hadn't locked the bolt. He hadn't hidden his child. He'd stepped into the storm, given away the coat off his back, and told them to come inside. That kind of thing couldn't be faked. Raven tilted her head, slightly studying him. "You served," she said. Not a question. Martin met her eyes. "Yeah, a lifetime ago." She nodded once, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Explains it. Explains why you didn't run." The night stretched on. Cards appeared from one biker's pocket, and soon a quiet game started in the corner. Another pulled out a harmonica, playing low and bluesy, the sound mixing with the moan of the storm outside. For a brief moment, the North Star Bar felt less like a failing roadside diner and more like a refuge carved out of ice and time. Martin leaned against the counter, watching them. He saw more than leather and patches. He saw exhaustion. He saw scars that weren't all on skin. He saw people trying to survive a night that could have killed them on the highway. Ellie, fearless in her own childlike way, tiptoed from table to table, offering sugar packets and extra napkins, like she was the hostess of the grandest banquet. To Martin's surprise, the bikers treated her with a kind of reverence. They softened their voices. They tucked away their rough language. One even slid her teddy bear back to her when she dropped it, handling it as carefully as glass. And Martin thought, maybe this isn't just about sheltering them. Maybe it's about reminding them that even the fiercest storms can be endured if there's a light left burning. By midnight, the snow had buried the gas pumps outside. The radio confirmed the interstate was closed in both directions. The bikers settled into booths and corners, some dozing with arms crossed, others sipping the last of the coffee. Martin checked the register again. $53. That was all. And now 20 more mouths to feed. The math didn't add up. It never had. But when he glanced at Ellie curled against a biker's leather jacket, fast asleep and safe, and when he saw Raven sitting in the booth, his army coat still around her shoulders, he knew he'd made the right call. He'd opened the door, and he had no idea that decision would change his life forever. The storm outside raged without mercy, snow drumming against the roof, rattling the glass panes like a furious fist. But inside the North Star Bar, something unexpected had begun to take shape. The fearsome silence of 20 outlaw bikers had softened into a strange rhythm of order. For all their size, leather, and scars, they moved with an unspoken discipline. Martin noticed it as he poured the last of the coffee into chipped white mugs. They didn't crowd the counter. They didn't argue over seats. The older ones automatically claimed the booths nearest the heater, while the younger members deferred, sliding into spots near the door without complaint. A man with a jagged scar across his cheek wordlessly wiped snow puddles off the floor with a rag, while another stacked empty cups neatly by the sink. It reminded Martin of a squad in the field. Everyone knew their role. Everyone watched for weakness in the chain. Duke, the broad-shouldered sergeant-at-arms, finally broke the hush. He set a deck of worn cards on the counter with a heavy thud. "House rules," he said, his gravel voice carrying across the room. "2 hands, no bets we can't pay, and no sore losers." The bikers chuckled, the sound low and surprisingly warm. Ellie tilted her head, curious. "What's a sore loser?" Duke blinked down at her, then let out a rumble that might have been a laugh. "Means somebody who forgets how to lose, with grace, little star." Ellie's nose crinkled. "Daddy says losing's just practice for winning next time." For the first time, Martin heard genuine laughter roll through the room. Deep, rough, unexpected, like old engines turning over after years in the cold. Even Raven smiled, her eyes catching Martin's across the counter. When the soup bowls were empty, Martin started stacking them at the sink. He had half a mind to apologize for how little there was, but before he could, Raven stood. She tapped the table with 2 fingers, and the room quieted. "We owe the man and his girl respect," she said. "So we follow rules. His house, his call." Duke nodded solemnly. "No fights. No foul mouths around the kid. We clean what we use. Everyone clear." A chorus of grunts and nods followed. Martin blinked. He'd expected trouble. He'd braced for slammed fists, maybe broken glass. Instead, he watched as hardened bikers carefully stacked their plates, wiped crumbs from the counter, and even scraped boots before moving across the linoleum. "Not what you expected, huh?" Raven said, her voice low as she leaned closer. Martin smirked faintly. "Not exactly." Raven's eyes narrowed with something between challenge and humor. "We're outlaws, not animals." As the hours slipped past, stories began to surface. Not all at once, these were men and women who trusted slowly, but enough to remind Martin that the patches on their jackets didn't erase the humanity beneath. One older rider named Marcus pulled out a photo of his son in uniform. He showed it to Ellie, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle, as he explained third tour in Afghanistan. "Comes home in a month, Lord willing." Ellie studied the picture with wide eyes. "He looks brave." Marcus swallowed hard. "He is. Too brave sometimes." Another biker, Carlos, told Martin about the time his bike had broken down 2 winters ago, stranded on a mountain pass. He'd thought he was done for, until a stranger in a pickup stopped, gave him a blanket, and drove 2 hours out of the way to deliver him to safety. Never forgot that Carlos said, staring into his coffee. "Kindness hits harder than a fist sometimes." Martin nodded. He understood. More than they could know. Then came the moment that shifted the room. Leo, the young prospect, had been quiet, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched like a boy waiting for punishment. Finally, with a nervous glance at Raven, he whispered, "This place feels familiar." Martin raised an eyebrow. "You've been through before." Leo hesitated, then nodded. "Couple years back. I was in a bad way. Bike was out of gas. Had maybe $5 to my name." His voice cracked. "Some guy, maybe it was you, gave me pie, and coffee, said it was on the house." Martin frowned, trying to remember. He'd done that more times than he could count. "You told me," Leo said, his eyes shining. "Sometimes not knowing where you're going is the first step to finding where you belong." The diner went still. Ellie's hand slid into Martin's. Raven stared at him with something new in her gaze. Respect, curiosity, maybe even awe. Martin cleared his throat, uncomfortable under so many eyes. "I just said what I thought might help." Leo shook his head. "It saved me. That day, I almost gave up. You gave me enough hope to keep riding." He looked around at his brothers and sisters in leather. "Now I'm here. With them. With you." Silence hung thick, heavier than the storm outside. And then Duke set his cards down, his expression firm. "Man's right. Sometimes words save more than fists." He looked at Martin. "We don't forget debts." Raven broke the tension by standing. She shrugged the army coat more tightly around her shoulders, like it was armor instead of cloth. "Rest up," she told her crew. "Morning will come fast, and the storm's not letting up." The bikers obeyed, sliding into booths, stretching across chairs, their movements disciplined even in exhaustion. Within minutes, the room filled with the sound of heavy breathing and soft snores. Martin dimmed the lights, then lingered by the window. Snow piled higher against the pumps, burying them deeper by the hour. The bank notice on the counter seemed to glow in the dim light, mocking him with its cold words. 7 days. He rubbed a hand over his face. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to stretch $53 to cover 20 guests. Tomorrow he'd face the man in a suit who wanted to take everything away. But tonight he had given shelter. And somehow the house felt less empty. As he turned toward the booths, he saw Ellie curled against Raven's side, the army coat tucked around them both. Raven's eyes were closed, but her arm lay across the child protectively, as though she had always belonged there. For the first time in years, Martin allowed himself a fragile thought. Maybe hope hasn't died yet. The storm hadn't relented. By dawn, the diner's windows were coated in ice so thick, Martin had to scrape a clear circle just to peer outside. Beyond, the gas pumps were half buried. The highway vanished beneath drifts that looked like frozen waves. The world had become an ocean of white, and the North Star bar stood like a tiny ship alone, but still afloat. Inside, the bikers stirred one by one, rising from booths with stiff joints and frost-stiffened leather. Their voices were low, husky from sleep, but no one complained. Martin brewed the last pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the space like a promise. Ellie hummed to herself as she set out mismatched mugs, her teddy bear perched on the counter like an assistant waiter. It was Raven who noticed the sign above the coffee machine. The letters painted years ago by Martin's late wife had faded, but were still clear. North Star, keep the light on. Raven traced the words with her eyes before turning to Martin. Why call it that, she asked. Martin paused, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. He hadn't expected the question, not from her. Most travelers just assumed it was a name chosen for nostalgia. Few asked for the story. He set the pot down. You ever get lost at night on the open road? Raven raised a brow. Always. Then you know the North Star. Doesn't move, doesn't flicker, always points the way home. He glanced at Ellie, who was busy aligning the mugs in a neat row. My wife Rachel used to say people needed the same thing somewhere they could look and know they weren't alone. When we bought this place, she said it wasn't just a diner. It was a beacon, a promise. His voice tightened, and he looked down. She passed 3 years ago. But I've kept the sign lit, even when there's no one on the road, even when I couldn't pay the bills. The bikers had fallen quiet. Even Duke, who usually filled silence with grunts or orders, stayed still. Raven studied him for a long moment. The coat he'd given her still hung around her shoulders, the fabric carrying more history than she wanted to admit. So this isn't just a roof, she said softly. It's a vow. Martin met her eyes. That's right. Later, as Ellie dozed with her head on the counter, Raven stepped outside into the storm. Martin followed, worried she might wander too far, but stopped when he saw her lift her phone, shielding it from the snow as she tried to catch a signal. Her braid whipped in the wind, her tattooed hand steady despite the cold. He could hear fragments of her voice through the gale. Yeah, it's me. Stranded. North Star bar. No listening helped us. Him and the kid. I need favors called in. Martin leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. When she ended the call and turned, he didn't pretend he hadn't heard. You're calling in help, he said. Raven's jaw tightened. You gave us your light. I'm making sure it doesn't go out. Martin studied her. There was no softness in her tone, but there was steel of a different kind. Loyalty, the kind forged in fire. You don't owe me anything. Wrong, she said, stepping closer until the storm almost swallowed her words. In my world, debts are sacred. You sheltered us. You sheltered me." She tugged the coat tighter around her. "That doesn't get forgotten." For the first time, Martin caught a glimpse of something beyond the outlaw leader, a woman who had carried burdens of her own, who knew what it meant to walk through life armored because no one else had offered warmth. Back inside, Ellie had woken. She rubbed her eyes and looked at Raven, then at Martin. Daddy, did Mommy pick the name too? Martin crouched to meet her gaze. His throat tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, baby. Mommy said the North Star always shines even when it's dark. She said, as long as we keep it lit, people will always find their way." Ellie smiled, sleepy but sure. "Then we'll never turn it off." Raven's expression flickered a shadow of something Martin couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe, or longing. She reached out, brushing a loose curl from Ellie's face. "Your mama was right," she said quietly. Duke cleared his throat from the corner. "Boss, we got a problem. Food's gone. Gas, too." If the storm lasts another night, Martin's stomach knotted. He'd known it was coming. He could make do without, but Ellie couldn't. He looked at the register, $53, staring back like a cruel joke. Raven caught his eye. "How long do you have?" He didn't want to answer, but her gaze was steady, unrelenting. 7 days, he admitted finally. Then the bank takes it. This place, the Star, everything. The bikers shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances. They weren't strangers to debt collectors, but none of them had expected the man who'd given them shelter to be drowning himself. Raven leaned forward, her voice low but sharp as a knife. 7 days is time enough. Martin frowned. For what, Raven pulled the coat tighter and looked at him as if she'd already made a vow. To prove a light like this doesn't get put out. That night, as the bikers settled again into booths and corners, Martin sat at the counter staring at the faded letters above the coffee machine. Keep the light on. It had been Rachel's promise. Now, it was his. But for the first time since she passed, he wasn't carrying it alone. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, the North Star burned steady. And somewhere between the storm and the silence, Martin realized something Raven Knox, the outlaw queen with fire in her veins, might just be part of the reason his light stayed lit. The storm pressed down heavier as night returned. The diner windows rattled, glass fogged by the heat of too many bodies breathing the same air. Martin had seen his share of nights where survival came down to grit and sheer stubbornness. Tonight had that same feel. The bikers had spread out in their own rhythm. Some leaned back in booths, heads tilted against cracked vinyl, eyes closed, but never fully asleep. A few muttered low over a card game, the scrape of paper against laminate tabletops, a strange comfort against the storm's howl. Ellie had fallen asleep, curled on 2 chairs, pushed together teddy bear tucked under her chin. Raven sat nearby, Martin's old army coat, wrapped tight around both herself and the child like a shield. It should have been chaos. Instead, the place hummed with a strange calm. The kind of calm that comes only when people who live on the edge of law and weather realize they've been granted a fragile sanctuary. Martin leaned against the counter, rag in hand, but his eyes were on them. These people were rough tattoos, inked deep scars carved by fists. Or worse, but they treated Ellie like she was untouchable. Not because she was off limits, but because she reminded them of something they hadn't seen in years: innocence. And then, as often happened in long nights, the stories began. It was Marcus who spoke first. He was one of the older men, his beard-silvered tattoos fading on weathered skin. He tapped ash into a paper cup, his voice low. "This ain't the first time I've sat in this place." Martin frowned. "I don't remember seeing you before." Marcus smirked. "That's because it was 15 years back. Snowstorm kinda like this. My bike busted out by mile marker 72. Thought I was done. Then some guy probably you pulled over in an old Chevy loaded my machine into the bed and brought me here. Fed me chili and coffee till I thawed. Martin squinted, digging through memories. He'd been younger then, freshly discharged. Restless. He did remember a broken bike, a man near frozen stiff. That was you, Marcus nodded. You never charged me a dime. I tried to pay, but you just said, get back on the road and don't look back. Been carrying that with me since. The room shifted. A silence full of weight settled over the booths. The younger bikers looked at Marcus with new eyes, like he'd just cracked open part of their own history they didn't know. Then Carlos spoke up, his voice accented warm despite the edge in it. 5 years ago. My daughter was in a wreck down in Denver. I stopped here because I didn't know the roads. Couldn't think straight. He nodded at Martin. You drew me a map on the back of a napkin. Gave me coffee sandwich, even gas money. Told me, drive fast, but drive careful. She needs you alive, not reckless. Martin remembered that one. He hadn't thought about it in years, but the look on Carlos's face, now etched with gratitude, made the memory sharp again. You found her in time, Martin asked quietly. Carlos's voice wavered. Yeah. She's alive 'cause of you. The silence deepened. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. And then from the back, the quietest voice of all, Leo, the young prospect. His hands trembled around his mug, eyes darting from Raven to Martin, as if asking permission. Raven gave him a small nod. I came through 3 years ago, Leo said. Wasn't wearing colors then. Wasn't wearing much of anything but shame. He swallowed hard. Parents kicked me out. Lost my job. No money. I was riding west, thinking maybe I'd just stop somewhere and not start again. Martin's throat tightened. I stopped here, Leo whispered. Bike barely running, tank dry. I had $5. You gave me pie and coffee anyway. Told me, sometimes not knowing where you're going is the first step to finding where you belong. Martin blinked. He had no memory of the boy, but the words sounded like something Rachel might have said, something he'd repeated without thinking. Leo's hands shook harder. That night, I decided not to quit. I rode on. Met these people. Met her. He nodded toward Raven. And now, I belong. The room was stone silent. Even Duke, hard as granite, had his jaw set tight. Raven broke the stillness, her voice low but steady. You see, Martin, this place, you're not just shelter in a storm. You've been a star on this road for a long time. We've all crossed it. And we don't forget debts. Martin wanted to argue, to wave it off, but the weight of their eyes stopped him. He looked down at the rag in his hand, at the old counter nicked and scarred from years of service. He'd never thought much of handing out pie or drawing maps, just small kindnesses. But to them, those small acts had been lifelines. He felt Rachel's presence then, like he always did when he brushed against something larger than himself. She used to say, "Keep the light on, Marty. Someone will need it." And they had. Duke leaned forward, cards forgotten. We take care of our own. You opened your door, fed us when you had nothing. That makes you ours too. Martin stiffened. He'd heard those words before in different contexts, and they'd never been good. But Duke's tone wasn't threat, it was vow. Raven pulled the army coat tighter. 7 days, she said, eyes never leaving his. That's what you told me. 7 days until the bank takes this place. Martin's stomach nodded. Yeah, she tilted her head, a predator assessing prey. But there was no malice in her gaze, only determination. Then we've got 7 days to make sure the North Star doesn't go dark. As the bikers settled back, Martin stood at the window, again staring out at the storm. The snow had risen so high, it nearly covered the neon sign. But inside, the light still glowed faint and stubborn. Behind him, Ellie stirred in her sleep, murmuring words from a dream. Raven tucked the coat around her more tightly, her eyes soft for the first time all night. And Martin realized something that sent a shiver through him, deeper than the storm could. These weren't just strangers. They were threads woven quietly through the fabric of his life for years. And now they were all pulled together, in the same place, in the same storm. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe it was the North Star doing what it was always meant to do, guiding the lost home. The North Star bar had fallen into an uneasy quiet. 20 bikers lay scattered across booths and chairs, their heavy breathing mingling with the low hum of the furnace. The storm outside still howled, but inside a rare peace held steady, fragile as glass. Martin sat at the counter with a cooling cup of coffee, his elbows on the worn formica. He should have been exhausted. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. But the words from earlier about old debts and lives touched still echoed in his mind. Rachel's voice, too. Keep the light on, Marty. He rubbed a hand over his face. His daughter slept, curled in Raven's coat, tucked safely in a booth between Raven and Marcus. That image, his little girl, breathing slow and easy against the shoulder of a woman whose reputation could freeze. Lesser men would have been unthinkable hours ago. But here they were. And Raven. She wasn't asleep. Not yet. Martin noticed her slip free from the booth, moving with quiet precision so Ellie wouldn't stir. She pulled his old army coat around her shoulders and crossed the diner toward the door. Her boots barely made a sound on the linoleum. Martin followed, not with suspicion, but instinct. Outside, the storm still clawed at the walls, snow blasting sideways, like sand in a desert wind. Raven pushed open the door, letting the cold slice into the warm air. Martin pulled his jacket tight and stepped after her. The wind hit them like a hammer. Snow stung his eyes. Raven braced herself against the Gale phone in hand, her braid whipping like a banner. Martin could hear her raised voice carried away by the storm. Stranded. North Star Bar. No, listen, it matters. The man and his kid kept us alive. I'm calling in favors. Yeah, all of them. Martin stood just inside the doorway watching her fight the storm, and whoever was on the other end of the line. Her posture was hard, her tone sharp. This was the side of her that commanded loyalty, the outlaw queen, who ruled by grit and fire. She turned, caught his eyes through the snow. For a heartbeat, he saw something else there. Not just command, not just steel. Vulnerability. Determination born not of pride, but of gratitude. She ended the call and trudged back inside, stamping snow from her boots. Her cheeks were raw from the cold, her breath heavy. You were listening, she said flatly. Martin shrugged. Hard not to. Raven narrowed her eyes. Then you know. You saved us last night. That's not something I let slide. You don't owe me anything, Martin said. She pulled the coat tighter, the faded green swallowing her frame. In my world, debts aren't optional. You gave me your light. I'll make sure it doesn't go out. Back inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. Most of the bikers were still asleep, but Duke stirred at the counter, his eyes sharp despite the hour. He had the look of a man who slept with one ear open, a soldier of a different kind. Boss, he said to Raven, his voice low. We good? Raven nodded. Calls are made. Duke gave a grunt that might have been approval. Then we'll be ready. Martin poured Raven a cup of coffee. She accepted it, her inked hand steady, now her gaze softer. You keep saying this place is a star, she said. Maybe you're right. Stars don't shine for themselves. They shine for everyone else. Martin looked at her, unsure how to answer. Her words cut closer than she knew. Rachel had said nearly the same thing once years ago. A light isn't meant to be hidden, Marty. It's meant to guide. He forced a breath, steadying his voice. That light's all I've got left. If it goes out, I don't know what's left of me. Raven's eyes didn't waver. Then it won't go out. Later, when most of the bikers had resettled into sleep, Raven lingered near the counter. Martin found himself sitting across from her, the only sound the hiss of the coffee machine and the storm pressing against the walls. "You lost someone," Raven said quietly, not as a question. Martin stiffened, then nodded. "My wife. Cancer. 3 years back." He glanced at Ellie sleeping peacefully. "She made me promise to keep this place open, to keep the light on." Raven's jaw worked like she was chewing on words too heavy to swallow. "My brother," she finally said. "Afghanistan. He came home in a box. Government sent me a flag and a letter. No coat. No warmth. Just a hole I've been trying to fill ever since." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two people recognizing the same scar in different shapes. Martin studied her face. Strong, hard, but beneath it something cracked. "Maybe that's why you lead them," he said. Raven gave a dry laugh. "Or maybe I just didn't know what else to do with the anger." "You could have turned it against the world," Martin said. "Instead, you turned it into loyalty." "That's not nothing." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. In them was a storm, all her own. By dawn, the storm outside had only grown worse, but inside the North Star, something fragile had taken root. The bikers stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching sore shoulders. Ellie woke with a yawn, Raven's coat still around her. She looked at Martin and smiled, simple and pure. For the first time in years, Martin felt something stir inside him too. A flicker of hope, a recognition that he wasn't carrying Rachel's promise alone anymore. Raven set her empty cup down. 7 days, she said again. Steady as iron. "That's time enough." Martin frowned. Time enough for what? Her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile, for the roar to answer the light. He didn't know what she meant, but he would. And when he did, the sound of it would shake the mountains. Morning came without sunlight. The storm hadn't cleared. It had thickened. Snow pressed against the diner windows in waves, muffling the world outside, until it felt like the North Star bar was buried alive. The neon sign still glowed red through the frost, but barely like a candle fighting against the dark. Martin stood at the counter rubbing his temples. He hadn't slept. Raven's words from the night before. 7 days is time enough echoed in his mind. He didn't know what she meant, but she'd said it like a vow. And vows Martin knew weren't things people like her broke. Ellie shuffled out from the back, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. "Daddy, it's morning," she said, climbing onto a stool beside him. Her smile was small but steady, as though she could hold the world together with that alone. Martin kissed her hair. "Yeah, baby. Morning." Behind them, the bikers stirred. Leather cracked as stiff joints stretched. Boots stamped the floor. The storm had kept them grounded, but none complained. They moved with the quiet resolve of people who knew they were at the mercy of the mountain. Then a sound cut through the storm that didn't belong, the crunch of tires over snow. A vehicle, heavy and deliberate, pulling into the lot. Martin's chest tightened. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The bank. The door swung open, wind swirling in with a blast of cold air. A man in a dark wool coat stepped inside, shaking snow from his shoulders. His glasses fogged instantly. He removed them with a measured slowness that seemed rehearsed, polished. "Mr. Greaves," he said, voice clipped and professional. "I didn't expect you to be entertaining company." His eyes scanned the room, the booths filled with leather tattoo scars. He blinked once, his face giving away nothing. Martin kept his tone even. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell." The banker placed a leather briefcase on the counter, flipping it open with careful precision. Papers stacked neatly inside. He pulled out the one Martin had been dreading. Your account is 3 months past due, Caldwell said. As of today, interest has compounded. Unless payment is rendered, the property will be seized. Ellie gripped her teddy bear tighter. Daddy, she whispered. Martin put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. The bikers shifted. Duke leaned forward. Thick arms crossed over his chest, his gaze narrowing on Caldwell. Raven rose from her booth, her presence like a storm inside the storm. She stepped up beside Martin, the army coat still wrapped around her. This isn't the time, Martin said, his voice flat. It's exactly the time, Caldwell countered. The storm doesn't change the numbers. You have until sundown. The words hit heavier than the blizzard outside. Sundown. Less than 12 hours. Martin wanted to argue, but he didn't have the numbers. $53. That was all. He could no more fight this battle with cash than he could fight the storm with his bare hands. But then Raven spoke, her voice low, but cutting through the room like steel. Funny thing about numbers, she said, her eyes on Caldwell. They don't measure worth, or loyalty, or debts you don't see coming. Caldwell's brow furrowed. And you are Raven Knox, she replied, her tone cool as ice. And right now, you're standing in a house that belongs to more people than you think. The bikers stirred, their presence suddenly louder than words. Marcus pushed away from his booth. Carlos rose slowly, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the banker. Even young Leo stood nervous but determined, his jaw tight. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. This is a matter of legal property. Sentiment won't alter the outcome. Martin held up a hand, silencing both sides. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Let me talk. He looked at Caldwell, then at the group behind him. This place isn't just walls and tables, Martin said. It's a promise. My wife and I built it to be a light for travelers, any traveler. I don't care about your patches or your past. If you're cold, you come in. If you're hungry, you eat. That's the vow. His voice broke, but he pressed on. I know I'm behind. I know numbers don't lie. But this storm, these people, he gestured toward the bikers. They're proof that a light like this still matters. The room was still. Even Caldwell hesitated. Then Raven placed a hand on Martin's arm. You said 7 days, she murmured. You've got less than 1 now. But trust me, we're not done. She turned back to Caldwell, her eyes sharp. You'll get your answer before sundown. But when it comes, don't pretend you weren't warned. Caldwell slid the foreclosure notice across the counter. I'll return at dusk, he said. One way or another. He closed his briefcase, snapped it shut, and left. The door swung wide, snow rushing in, then slammed behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. The bikers watched Martin waiting. Ellie clutched his sleeve, eyes wide. Martin swallowed hard. That's it, he said. If we don't find a miracle by nightfall, the North Star goes dark. Raven straightened the army coat falling open to reveal the fire beneath her calm. She looked at Duke, then at Marcus, then at every rider in the room. Make the call, she ordered. Duke nodded once, pulling out a phone. Marcus was already on his feet, dialing. Carlos headed toward the window, searching for a signal. Even Leo fumbled with his device, determination overcoming fear. Martin blinked. What are you doing? Raven met his gaze. You gave us shelter when no one else would. Now we call the road. And the road always answers. Her eyes burned with certainty, the kind of certainty that turned storms into fuel. Martin wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that something bigger than numbers could save this place. But as he looked at the foreclosure notice lying like a death sentence on the counter, he wondered if even the roar of 100 engines could drown out the sound of a bank's gavel. The hours after Caldwell left dragged like a slow bleed. The paper he had slid across the counter lay untouched, but Martin felt its weight pressing against his chest. Each time he looked at the foreclosure notice, the bold letters shouted louder than the storm outside seized. The bikers had scattered into corners of the diner, phones pressed to ears, voices pitched low but urgent. Duke barked instructions like a sergeant on the line. Marcus scribbled names and numbers onto a napkin, crossing out one, circling another. Carlos held his phone high by the frosted window, muttering in Spanish as he fought for reception. Even young Leo was trying his nervous voice, cracking as he explained to someone, "It's the North Star." Yeah, that North Star. Raven didn't sit. She paced. Her boots thudded against the floor with every step, her braids swaying like a pendulum, Martin's old coat billowing around her frame. She was restless, energy, made flesh a storm within the storm. Martin watched all of it from behind the counter. He wanted to ask what exactly they thought would happen. He wanted to tell them not to get their hopes up, not to get his hopes up. But when he caught Ellie twirling her teddy bear in slow circles and whispering, "The light won't go out," he kept silent. By mid-afternoon, the storm outside had shifted from horizontal fury to a steady vertical fall, thick flakes piling high and heavy. Visibility stretched maybe 50 feet. Beyond that, the mountains were a blank canvas. And then Martin heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind changing pitch, a low hum faint beneath the storm. Then it grew louder, layered, a rhythm of pistons, the distinct growl of motorcycles, not one, not 10, many, engines, dozens of them. The bikers inside the diner froze, heads lifted, phones were set down. Duke stepped to the window, wiped a circle in the condensation with his fist, and squinted. "They're coming," he said. The sound thickened, swelled, rolled over the mountain like thunder breaking through cloud. It was more than noise. It was presence, physical and overwhelming. The storm itself seemed to retreat from it, muffled but powerless to smother the roar. Martin moved to the window, his heart pounding. Through the swirling snow, he saw lights, pairs of them, cutting through the white. Then shadows, dark shapes moving in formation. One by one, motorcycles emerged from the storm. Chrome glinted beneath frost. Leather patches flashed in the light. Rows upon rows, pulled into the lot, engines, revving headlights, cutting through the haze. Not 20, not 50, 100, more. By the time the line stopped, the diner was surrounded on all sides. Martin counted his breath, fogging the glass. 120 bikes, their engines gunning in unison, sending vibrations through the frozen ground until the very walls of the diner rattled. The bikers inside erupted with cheers, fists slamming on tables, voices booming with pride. Marcus clapped Leo on the shoulder so hard the boy nearly toppled. Carlos let out a shout in Spanish, the joy in his voice unmistakable. Raven didn't cheer. She stepped to the door, pulled it open, and let the storm rush in. The engines roared louder, greeting her like a queen returning to her throne. Snow whipped into the diner, but no one cared. "Brothers," she shouted, her voice carried by wind and steel. "Sisters!" The riders outside raised their fists, some horns blaring, others revving in response. Raven turned her eyes, locking on Martin. "You gave us your light," she said. "Now see what the road gives back." One by one, riders dismounted. They filled the lot boots, crunching against packed snow patches from chapters across the region flashing in the storm. Denver, Salt Lake, Phoenix, Oakland. Some faces were hardened by age, others barely out of their 20s, but all carried the same fierce loyalty in their eyes. The diner door opened and shut in waves as riders filed inside. They crowded the space until every booth, every stool, every inch of floor was filled. The air grew thick with leather and cold air, but also with something else, community. Martin stood behind the counter, stunned, as men and women he had never seen before clasped. His hand clapped his back, nodded in recognition. Some told him stories of nights long ago when a cup of coffee, a sandwich, or a kind word had kept them going. Others simply said, We heard the call. By the time the rush settled, the counter was covered in envelopes, some thick with bills, others thinner, but no less meaningful. Cash. Pledges. IOUs written in hurried scrawl. Duke stacked them carefully, his expression grim but proud. This is just the start, he told Martin. More's coming. Martin stared at the pile, disbelief and hope warring in his chest. Why, he asked. Why would you all Raven cut him off? Because you kept the light on when we needed it. Now it's our turn. Ellie slipped her small hand into Martin's. She looked around the packed diner, her eyes wide with wonder. Daddy, she whispered, they came for us. Martin swallowed hard, his throat tight. They did, baby. They did. Outside, the engine still rumbled a chorus that refused to die down. The mountain echoed with it, a hymn of steel and loyalty. The North Star, buried in snow, had become the heart of something larger than Martin had ever dreamed. And as he looked at Raven, standing tall in his old coat, her hair dusted with snow, her eyes locked on his. Martin understood something. This wasn't just about saving a diner. This was about proving that light once given always finds its way back. The roar lingered long after the last engine shut down. It vibrated in the walls, echoed in the floorboards, and hummed in Martin's chest like the aftershock of an earthquake. 120 motorcycles now sat in the diner's parking lot, their chrome catching what little light filtered through the blizzard, their riders filling every corner of the North Star bar. It should have been chaos. Instead, it felt like order, the kind that came not from rules written in books, but from bonds written in blood and steel. Martin stood behind the counter, staring at the pile of envelopes Duke had stacked neatly. Cash. Promises. Enough that the register, long empty of anything but dust and dimes, now bulged like it hadn't in years. Raven leaned against the counter beside him, his old army coat still around her shoulders. She hadn't spoken since the flood of riders arrived, but her presence spoke louder than words. She looked every inch the commander of a battalion, except instead of fatigues, she wore leather and ink. Finally, Duke's gravelly voice cut through the din. "We need order," he said, rapping his knuckles on the counter. The room fell into silence. Even in a crowd this size, respect for hierarchy ran deep. Raven straightened. "Then let's make it clear. This isn't just about tonight. This place," she gestured around the diner to the flickering lights. The cracked vinyl booths, the hand-painted North Star sign is more than a roof. It's a beacon. And we don't let beacons go dark. A murmur of assent rippled through the room, low and strong. Marcus stepped forward holding a rolled-up sketch. He spread it on the counter. The paper was creased, smudged with grease, but the lines were clear. An expanded diner with an attached garage. A biker's lounge, reinforced parking, even a small stage in the corner. This, Marcus said, tapping the drawing with a calloused finger, is what the North Star could be. A haven. Not just for us, but for every rider on these roads. A place where the light stays on no matter what. Martin stared at the paper. He hadn't dreamed like this in years. The idea that his wife's dream, their dream, could grow instead of wither, sent a shock through him. But practicality surged up, the old voice of caution. "I can't pay for this," he said flatly, "even with what you've brought." The bank Raven cut him off. "The bank's got numbers. We've got something stronger." She scanned the room. "Brothers. Sisters, you with me?" The roar of approval shook the rafters. Boots stomped. Fists slammed the tables. Duke raised a hand, commanding silence again. "Here's the pact," he said, his voice like gravel grinding against steel. "Every chapter represented here, Denver, Oakland, Phoenix, Salt Lake, and more will send riders on rotation. Weekly stops. Guaranteed business. Coffee, food, gas, repairs. Every mile a brother rides ends with a stop here. Carlos added his accent thick but voice steady, and every rider brings protection. No one touches this place. Not a thief, not a banker, not anyone who thinks they can muscle in. 50 miles in every direction, North Star is sacred ground. The younger bikers nodded eagerly. Even Leo puffed out his chest, pride shining in his eyes. Martin tried to speak, but his throat closed. He swallowed hard. Why was all he managed? A grizzled rider from Oakland, his arms thick as tree trunks, stepped forward. His voice was surprisingly gentle. Because, soldier, you gave us a home when we had none. We don't forget that. And we don't abandon our own. The room echoed with a single word, shouted from dozens of throats: family. Ellie stirred from her nap, blinking against the noise. She rubbed her eyes and climbed onto a stool, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. Daddy, she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. They're making promises. Martin crouched, so he was level with her. Yes, baby. Big ones. Then you have to promise too, Ellie said. Her small voice somehow cut through the crowd. Heads turned. You have to promise to keep the light on. Always. Silence fell. Raven's gaze locked on Martin, her eyes steady as stone. She didn't speak, but the challenge was there. Martin's chest tightened. He thought of Rachel, of nights he'd sat alone wondering if he could keep her dream alive, of the foreclosure notice still lying on the counter like a loaded weapon. He rose, slowly facing the room. Then here's my part, he said, voice low but steady. I promise the North Star stays lit, no matter what storm comes. This light doesn't go out. The roar that followed rattled the windows. Boots pounded. Engines outside fired back to life in a chorus that shook the mountains. When the noise died down, Raven stepped closer, so close Martin could feel the warmth of her, even through the coat he'd given her. This isn't charity, she said, her voice meant only for him. This is a pact. You gave us shelter. We give you the road. From now on, you're not alone. Her hand brushed his forearm, brief but grounding. For a heartbeat, the storm outside faded, and the only sound was his own racing pulse. Martin looked at her, really looked at her. She was fire and frost battle and bomb danger and safety all at once. And he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Rachel passed. Hope. That night, as the storm finally began to wane, Martin stood at the window. The lot was a sea of chrome and steel, a congregation of loyalty and thunder. Behind him, the diner buzzed with voices and laughter. The sketches of a future spread across his counter. For the first time in years, he didn't see the North Star as something crumbling. He saw it as something rising. And when he turned back, Raven was watching him, her eyes fierce, her expression unreadable. But there was a softness there, too, hidden like the first star breaking through the night. The pact was sealed, and the North Star had never burned brighter. By morning, the storm had thinned into a quiet drift, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Snowbanks towered higher than the diner's neon sign, and the highway was buried, as if erased from the map. The North Star stood like an island in a white sea, the only warmth for miles. Inside the diner pulsed with life. Boots thudded, voices rumbled. The smell of strong coffee and leather mixed with the cold air slipping through cracks in the windows. Sketches of the expansion, Marcus's drawings, smudged with fingerprints, were pinned to the wall like battle plans. But the weight of Caldwell's words still hung over the room's sundown. Martin stared at the foreclosure notice on the counter. The paper was small, flimsy even, but it felt heavier than the 100 men and women crowding his diner. Numbers on a page threatening to crush everything Rachel had built with him. He rubbed his temples. All this noise, all these bikes, it won't mean a thing if I can't prove to the bank this place can stand. Raven slid into the stool beside him, the old army coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. She leaned close, voice low. Then we'll give them proof. Not just noise. Paper. Martin gave a dry laugh. Paper's what's killing me. Then we fight them with their own weapon, Raven said. But we don't fight alone. The door swung open. Snow blew in with Caldwell, the banker brushing flakes from his overcoat. His glasses fogged instantly in the heat, but his posture remained rigid, unimpressed. His eyes flicked across the room, narrowing at the crowd of leather and steel. "Mr. Greaves," he said crisply, "the deadline has arrived." Before Martin could speak, Duke stood towering like a wall of muscle and ink. "You're not foreclosing on this place today." Caldwell blinked, his voice calm. "And your family," Duke said. Simply. The word carried. A dozen voices echoed it. "Family." Caldwell adjusted his glasses. "You can shout whatever you like. But unless I have legal proof of solvency, this property will be seized." Raven stepped forward, then her presence commanding silence. "You want paper? You'll get paper." She nodded at Marcus. He strode to the counter and slapped down a folder thick with signatures. "Affidavits," he said. "Letters of intent from every chapter within 500 miles. Regular business. Guaranteed income." Carlos added another folder. "Contracts with truckers. They'll fuel here, eat here, rest here. North Star becomes the hub." And then, to Martin's astonishment, a grizzled rider from Phoenix pulled out a phone and handed it over. On the screen was a lawyer in a suit tie, loosened voice steady. "Name's Donnelly. Licensed in 3 states. Your diner now has legal counsel pro bono." The room buzzed with approval. Caldwell blinked, caught off guard, but not shaken. "Intentions are not assets," he said sharply. "The bank requires payment." Martin's hands trembled. He reached for the envelopes piled on the counter, stuffed thick with bills. He shoved them across the surface. $68,000, he said. Cash. From the road. Gasps filled the diner. Even Caldwell faltered, his expression cracking. He shuffled through the stacks, eyes widening despite himself. This is irregular," he stammered. Raven stepped closer, her voice ablade. "Irregular. No, this is loyalty. This is debt paid back in full." Caldwell's face flushed. "It still requires approval. Paperwork. Authorization." That was when Ellie slid off her stool. Barefoot teddy bear in hand, she walked to the counter. She picked up a pen from beside the register and pushed it toward Caldwell with both hands. Her little voice was clear. "Please keep our light on," she said. Silence fell like snow. Even the hardest bikers shifted, eyes glassy. Raven's jaw tightened, her throat working as if the words had hit her, somewhere she didn't want to show. Caldwell stared at the child, his lips pressed thin. Finally, he exhaled, adjusting his glasses again. "I'll make the call." He stepped outside into the snow phone pressed to his ear, pacing beside the sea of chrome that lined the lot. Engines growled low riders, standing watch with arms crossed their presence, a silent wall of iron hearts around the diner. Martin stood at the window, watching. Every second felt like an hour. When Caldwell returned, his face was unreadable. He set the phone on the counter and snapped his briefcase shut. "The bank will extend your terms," he said curtly. "Payments restructured. Foreclosure halted. Pending review of contracts, this property is secured." The diner erupted. Cheers. Fists pounding tables. Engines outside roared to life in celebration, shaking the mountain air. Raven leaned close, her eyes blazing. "Paper shields," she whispered. "Iron hearts." Martin stared at her, relief flooding him, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight on his chest lifted. The North Star would live, and he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The storm had finally broken. By nightfall, the clouds had thinned to tatters, and moonlight spilled across the mountains in silver bands. Snow still blanketed the world in silence, but the roar of engines outside filled the valley with life. 120 bikes rumbled in unison, chrome glinting their riders celebrating the victory inside the diner. The foreclosure notice no longer sat on the counter like a death sentence. It was folded, signed over, neutralized. Caldwell had left his briefcase lighter and his certainty shaken. What had begun as one man's battle to keep a roof over his head had become something much bigger, a movement bound by steel and brotherhood. Martin stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge. He'd been in firefights, where bullets tore the air in storms, where sand blinded every step. He'd never felt a moment like this, a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph of fear finally giving way to hope. Ellie sat on a stool, wide-eyed, watching the riders cheer and clap each other's shoulders. She turned to her father, her voice soft but sure. "We did it, Daddy. Mommy's light is safe." Martin swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, baby. We did it." But his eyes drifted to Raven. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his old army coat still draped over her shoulders. The flicker of neon painted her tattoos in red and gold. She hadn't joined the cheering, though she was the reason any of this had happened. She just watched her expression unreadable until her gaze met his. Martin walked toward her, weaving through the press of riders. When he stopped in front of her, the room seemed to hush, though no one said a word. "You should keep it," he said, nodding at the coat. Raven arched a brow. "Your coat. Your past. Don't you want it back?" Martin shook his head. "It carried me through storms. Last night it carried you. Feels like it's yours now." For the first time, her guard slipped. Her lips parted not in defiance, but in something softer, something almost fragile. "No one's ever sheltered me like that," she admitted quietly. "Not since." She trailed off, shaking her head. Martin didn't push. He simply held her gaze. Then maybe it's time someone did. The bikers sensed the weight of the moment and turned away, giving the two space. Duke muttered something about checking the engines, and soon half the crew filed outside. Marcus struck up a tune on the harmonica, the low bluesy notes filling the silence without intruding. Raven took a step closer. "You don't know what you're offering, soldier. My world isn't clean. It's hard roads and harder choices. You sure you want that anywhere near your little girl?" Martin's jaw tightened. He looked past her, where Ellie giggled, as Carlos taught her how to shuffle a deck of cards twice her size. "She needs to see strength," he said. "Not just the kind that fights, but the kind that protects. You've got both." Raven exhaled, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "Careful, Martin. You're making me believe it." The night wore on, but the celebration never dulled. Riders came and went from the lot engines, revving like war drums, their echoes carrying across the valley. Inside, laughter replaced silence, stories flowed freer than coffee, and for the first time in years, the North Star felt alive. Ellie grew sleepy, her head nodding against her bear. Raven lifted the coat, wrapping it around the child, and pulling her gently into her lap. The sight stopped Martin cold. His daughter curled against Raven, as if she'd always belonged there, her small body safe in the arms of a woman the world saw as dangerous. It was then Martin realized what this was. Not just a diner saved, not just a debt repaid. This was healing. For him. For Raven. For everyone who had walked through storms carrying weight no one else could see. As midnight approached, the bikers dimmed the lights. Only the neon outside glowed, casting red across the snow. Martin stood by the switch, his hand resting against it. He looked at Raven, then at Ellie, then at the crowd of riders, who had come from every corner of the road to stand with him. He flicked the switch. The sign blazed bright, humming like a heartbeat, painting the snowbanks in scarlet light. "Keep the light on," Martin said, his voice steady, carrying through the diner. "Always." The room erupted again, Cheers engines roaring to life outside the symphony of chrome and thunder answering his vow. Raven rose. Ellie still sleeping in her arms. She walked to Martin and stopped just inches from him. "You've got your star," she said. "But don't forget, every star needs someone to fight the dark." Her eyes locked on his, fierce and unyielding. But beneath it, Martin saw something else, something raw, something that might one day grow into love. For now, it was enough. That night, long after the last bike settled into silence and the snow began to glitter under a thin moon, Martin stepped outside. He looked up at the clear patch of sky where the North Star shone steady and true. Behind him, Raven stood in the doorway, coat wrapped around her, and Ellie both. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Martin whispered into the cold air, his breath a cloud against the stars. "Rachel, the light's still on. And it's not just mine anymore." For the first time in years, the weight of his promise felt lighter, because now he wasn't carrying it alone. 6 months later, the Rockies shimmered beneath the bright wash of summer sun. The long snows had melted into rivers that cut through the mountains, carrying the last whispers of the blizzard away. On Highway 70, travelers could see something new rising where the old North Star bar once stood, tired and fading. The sign still read, North Star, but now it glowed from a polished steel frame with red and gold neon that could be seen for miles on a clear night. The parking lot stretched wide, freshly paved, lined with chrome rails for bikes and cars alike. Beyond the diner itself, a new wing had been added, a garage, a lounge, with broad windows, even a small stage where music drifted out on warm evenings. But the heart of it hadn't changed. The smell of coffee still greeted anyone who pushed open the door. The booths were still cracked in places, though now polished and mended. And the man behind the counter was still Martin Greaves, though 6 months had changed him too. He moved lighter, now, shoulders, straighter, eyes, clearer. The weight that had hung on him for years was gone, replaced by something sturdier purpose. He poured coffee into mugs, lined along the counter, the hum of conversation around him steady and familiar. Ellie darted between tables, her little shoes tapping the floor. She had taken to her role as hostess, with pride offering napkins, sugar packets, and sometimes just her bright smile. Every biker who stopped by greeted her with warmth. They called her Little Star, and she carried the nickname like a crown. And Raven. She was everywhere. Her presence hummed in the diner's bones, now as sure as the neon outside. She stood near the garage doors, sleeves rolled up, inked arms slick with grease as she guided younger riders through a repair. She leaned against the jukebox when the sun set, braid swaying coat still draped around her shoulders like a banner. She moved with authority but also with ease, as though she had finally found a place where she didn't need to lead by fear alone. When her eyes met Martin's across the room, there was no armor between them anymore. Just recognition. And something else neither of them needed to name. On this day, the lot filled faster than ever before. Bikes rolled in by the dozen, their engines rumbling like thunder across the valley. Trucks followed families with kids, leaning out windows, pointing at the sea of chrome. Locals came too, farmers, loggers, travelers, who had once thought of the North Star as just another diner. Now it was something more. The pact had held. Riders came from as far as California and Arizona, Salt Lake, and Phoenix. They stopped for fuel, for food, for repairs, for rest. They came because Raven called, because Duke promised, because Marcus drew up plans, and Carlos spread the word. But most of all, they came because of Martin, because once long ago, he had kept the light on when no one else would. That evening, the parking lot became a festival. Music rolled from the stage, harmonicas and guitars blending with the growl of engines. Smoke rose from grills, the smell of burgers, and ribs mingling with the scent of leather and oil. Ellie darted between riders, her laughter ringing out a little girl who had become the heartbeat of a family, far larger than blood. Martin stepped outside the sunset, painting the mountains gold. He stood on the steps of the diner, looking out at the crowd bikers, and families, strangers, and friends, all gathered because of a promise. Raven joined him, brushing grease from her hands. She leaned against the railing, the coat he had given her, now worn and weathered, but more hers than ever. "Quite a sight," she said. Martin nodded. "Never thought I'd see it." She smirked. "That's because you kept looking at numbers. But the road doesn't care about numbers. It cares about loyalty." Martin chuckled. "I should have figured that out sooner." Raven's eyes softened, the rare smile tugging at her lips. "You figured it out when it mattered." As night fell, the neon sign blazed to life. The words North Star shone bright against the mountain, dark casting red across chrome and steel. Engines revved in unison, a chorus that rattled the earth. Martin raised his hand, and slowly the engines quieted. The crowd turned toward him. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing on him like the silence before a storm. "My wife named this place," he began, his voice steady. "She said the North Star never goes out. She wanted it to be a light for travelers, a place where no one is turned away." He looked at Ellie perched on Raven's hip, her small hand waving at the crowd. He looked at Raven herself, steady as a mountain fire in her eyes. Then he looked at the sea of faces watching him, men and women who had answered a call louder than any storm. "I kept it lit as long as I could," he said. "But the truth is, I couldn't keep it alone. Not anymore. You kept it alive. All of you. This isn't just my diner now. It's yours. It's ours. And as long as this sign burns, the North Star will never go dark." The roar that followed was deafening. Engines fired, horns blared, voices rose in a wave that shook the valley. Ellie clapped her hands over her ears, giggling, while Raven only smiled, her eyes never leaving Martin's. Later, as the crowd spilled into the night, Martin stood with Raven at the edge of the lot. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the black. One star shone brighter than the rest, steady and unwavering. Raven folded her arms. "There it is," she said softly. "The one that never moves." Martin nodded. "The one that guides you home." She glanced at him. "So where's home for you now, soldier?" He looked at her, then at Ellie curled against her shoulder, then at the glowing diner alive with laughter and music. "Right here," he said, simply. Raven smiled, not sharp, not mocking, but real. She leaned her head against his shoulder just for a moment. The engines still rumbled. The neon still burned. And above them, the North Star kept its watch. 6 months ago, Martin Greaves had been a man waiting for his light to die. Tonight, he was the keeper of a beacon brighter than ever. And with Raven by his side, Ellie in his arms, and a family of iron hearts at his back, he knew the truth Rachel had seen long before him. The light was never his alone. It belonged to everyone the road had carried home. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and share your corner of the world with us. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next one. We've got many more tales of hope, love, and resilience to share with you. Most of all, thank you for spending your time with us. Your presence here is what keeps this channel's light shining bright. Until next time, may your road be safe, and may your heart always find its North Star.